While the word plagiarism entered the English vocabulary in the year 1601, the concept of plagiarism dates back to ancient times, with the Roman poet Martial using the Latin word plagiarius, meaning kidnapper, as early as 80 AD to describe copying someone else's work. Although the debate around the award winning Hindi film Lapata Ladies, whether it is a clear case of cut, copy, and paste from Arabic film Burqa City or not, still goes on, I thought of sharing a rather less known story of plagiarism allegations from the other corner of the world. Do you know renowned 19th century American deaf-blind author, disability rights advocate, political activist, and lecturer? Yes, the Helen Keller was herself once alleged of plagiarism. Yes, that's true. So here's what happened, or as I love to say it, the hua yon ke in the fall of 1891, Helen Keller, as an 11-year-old, wrote a beautiful short story as a birthday gift for Michael Anagnos, the director of the special school she went to, that is, Perkins School for the Blind. The story was titled The Frost King, and it described how King Frost and his fairies were responsible for the changing colors of the autumn leaves. And upon reading Little Helen's story, Anagnos was so impressed by her creativity, he called it in these exact words without parallel in the history of literature. And so, he got Helen's story published in the January 1892 edition of The Mentor, the school's alumni magazine. And then, Helen's Frost King was picked up by the Goodson Gazette, a Virginia based newsletter focusing deaf blind education. Now, while Anagnos was raving about Helen's work, soon after this Gazette publication, a reader of the Goodson Gazette recognized striking similarities between the Frost King and a charming tale about the origins of the colors of autumn leaves called The Frost Fairies by children's book author Margaret Canby, which had been published in her collection of short stories called Birdie and His Fairy Friends in 1873, that is, 7 years before Helen was born. Now, the Gazette once again published Helen's story, only this time alongside Margaret Canby's story, with the editor's comments that he believed it to be a deliberate attempt at fraud by Keller's caregivers. Well, the similarities in both the plot and language were significant. Hence, the discovery led to a serious accusation of plagiarism against Helen. And needless to say, this caused a major controversy and it deeply upset Helen, her special instructor Annie Sullivan, as well as her special school, that is the Perkins Institution. Anagnos, who had initially been Helen's defender, felt betrayed and launched an investigation. Now, here let me mention there's another version of what really happened, which we will come to a bit later. So, Anagnos assembled a panel of 8 to 9 experts from the Perkins staff to question Helen. The intense probing of the young deaf-blind child reportedly went on for 2 hours and was traumatic for her. In all of this, Annie Sullivan vehemently defended Helen, insisting that neither of them had ever heard of The Frost Fairies by Margaret Canby. And when Sullivan conducted her own investigation with the help of renowned inventor Alexander Graham Bell's aide, John Hitz, she discovered that Sophia Hopkins, a teacher at the special school Perkins, who was also Sullivan's own mentor, had taken charge of Helen during a summer vacation in 1888, that is, when Helen Keller was 8 years old, while Sullivan was on vacation. And this teacher, Sophia Hopkins, had read that book to Helen through finger spelling. Sullivan theorized that Helen must have unconsciously absorbed the story during that time, and it resurfaced years later as she attempted to write her original story. In Helen's defense, Sullivan argued that all use of language involves imitation and assimilation, especially for a child learning to express themselves. And interestingly, even Canby herself came forward to say that Keller's version was better than hers. However, Helen was devastated by the accusation. In her autobiography, The Story of My Life, she wrote of the profound grief and confusion she had experienced back then. It was difficult to make me understand this, but when I did understand, I was astonished and grieved. No child ever drank deeper of the cup of bitterness than I did. I had disgraced myself. I had brought suspicion upon those I loved best. She insisted she had no conscious recollection of ever hearing the Frost Fairies. The idea for the Frost King seemed to have come to her naturally. The panel of experts was reportedly divided, but Enignos, the head of the institute, ultimately voted in Helen's favor, formally acquitting her. However, the incident deeply damaged the relationship between Enignos, Helen, and Annie Sullivan. They eventually left the Perkins School. The accusation also left a lasting scar on Helen herself. According to some sources, she had a nervous breakdown over the incident, and of course, she never wrote fiction ever again in her life. Even in her later years, she remained sensitive about the issue of originality in her writing, often expressing uncertainty about whether her ideas were truly her own. When renowned writer, humorist, and essayist Mark Twain, a friend of both Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan, learned of the incident years later after reading Helen's autobiography, he wrote a famous St. Patrick's Day 1903 letter to Helen, downplaying the whole accusation and humorously suggesting that all ideas are essentially second-hand. Now let's come back to that second version of this whole situation around the plagiarism accusations on 11-year-old Helen and the ensuing investigations that I had mentioned earlier. So, according to this other version, after the plagiarism allegation raised by the editor of the Gazette, Helen found herself discussing the matter with one of the teachers at the Perkins Institute. During that conversation, she said something that sounded remarkably like a confession. The teacher, alarmed, took the matter to Michael Enignos, the head of the institute, who, up until that moment, had firmly stood by Helen's side. But after hearing the teacher's account, he felt betrayed and promptly ordered an internal investigation into the entire episode. Now, fast forward to the year 1978. Yes, that's 1978, a whole 87 years after the original inquiry. So, in the year 1978, a curious document surfaced in the Perkins Institute library. And this anonymously written typescript was titled Miss Sullivan's Methods. So, this anonymously written typescript titled Miss Sullivan's Methods came under the spotlight thanks to American political activist and writer Joseph Lash, who believed the analysis was likely penned by esteemed lawyer David Prescott Hall around 1906, shortly after Perkins Institute head Enignos' death. And the typescript meticulously examines Helen Keller's autobiography, The Story of My Life, identifying several of her early letters that echoed not just the ideas but sometimes the verbatim words from Margaret Canby's writing. The document also suggests that both Helen and Annie Sullivan had acknowledged the use of such passages when explaining the plagiarism charge. In fact, Sullivan herself admitted that Helen's writings from that time often included lengthy paraphrases of stories she had read herself or had heard being read to her. Interestingly, the document also included the very letter written by the Perkins Institute teacher transcribing her conversation with Helen, which had triggered the investigation in the first place. Joseph Lash believes the author of the typescript was trying to prove something quite specific, that it was Annie Sullivan, not Sophia Hopkins, who had read Birdie and His Fairy Friends to Helen, and also that it happened that very same autumn, that is in 1891, and not 4 years earlier as claimed by Sullivan. And Lash says if that is true, then number one, The Frost King by Helen was simply another paraphrased story in line with the kind Helen had been writing in her letters during that period. Number two, Sullivan, who always reviewed Helen's writings before they were sent out, had likely recognized the similarities between the two texts, but she believed it was original enough to be considered Helen's own creation. Number three, Sullivan may not have fully understood what constituted plagiarism at the time. Number four, when accusations emerged, Sullivan may have tried to protect Helen and herself by denying she had read the Birdie stories to her, urging Helen instead to claim that Sophia Hopkins had read them to her some years ago. So, which version speaks to you the most? Let us know in the comments. But regardless of which side of the story you lean toward, one thing remains clear. The Frost King controversy was a deeply formative and painful episode in Helen Keller's early life. And though she was officially exonerated, the incident highlighted the immense challenges faced by someone without sight or sound learning to communicate, and the extraordinary pressure placed on a young prodigy like Helen. Also, this story shows us how blurry the line between imitation and inspiration can be, and how sometimes even the purest intentions get caught in that fog. While speaking personally as a special needs educator, what stands out most powerfully for me is Annie Sullivan's fierce loyalty, her profound dedication, and her incredible insight into the complexities of Helen's learning journey. So, was it innocence or imitation, a forgotten fairy tale, or some buried memory? Maybe we'll never know the full truth, but what we do know is that a little girl who could neither see nor hear learned to speak to the world, and a teacher with no formal training gave her that voice. And that is no small miracle.